This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Dominaria United right now by going to cardkingdom.com/needsahone or following the link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Needsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Dominaria United limited set review. Yesterday we took a look at every multicolored and colorless card in the set, and today I'm continuing with a look at every white card. Tomorrow we'll take a look at every blue card, the day after that every black card, and so on until the review is complete. Before we jump in, a few things to keep in mind. First, this is a limited review. That means I'm only talking about the viability of these cards in this video for limited formats, which are draft and sealed. That also means I'm only talking about cards that appear in draft boosters, and because I'm reviewing these cards ahead of time, I'm going to be wrong about some of them, and that's the nature of a set review. Throughout the limited season, I'll post videos about my changing thoughts on the format. Lastly, I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on cards in my set reviews, and if you're unsure what these letter grades mean, you can find an explanation in the description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's take a look at our first white card. First up, there's Anointed Peacekeeper, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/3 human cleric at rare. It has vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, you look at your opponent's hand and then choose any card name. Spells your opponents cast with the chosen name cost 2 more to cast, and activated abilities of sources with the chosen name cost 2 more to activate unless they're mana abilities. It's pretty cool they're giving white this type of effect on creatures of late, because playing a 3 mana 3/3 with vigilance that also disrupts your opponent is a pretty nice deal. Slowing down whatever spell you're the most concerned about by 2 full turns is a very real thing. If the thing you name also happens to have activated abilities, it can be particularly backbreaking. This looks like a B. Next up, we've got Archangel of Wrath, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/4 angel at rare. It has Kicker for 1 black or 1 red. Kicker is a returning mechanic. It's the first time we're seeing it in this video, so I'll remind you what it does. If you pay these costs, you get an additional effect. Archangel of Wrath has flying and lifelink, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, it deals 2 damage to any target, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked twice, it deals 2 damage to any target. So we're going to see a lot of kicker costs that aren't the same color as the card, a returning feature that they went really hard on in the original invasion block, which was the first time the Phyrexians invaded Dominaria, so it makes sense. The thing to keep in mind with cards like this is that in an ideal world, you're at least splashing the kicker mana, and that will be reasonably easy to accomplish in this format thanks to what the mana looks like. You won't always be able to kick them, but you will be able to pretty often, and obviously that's even more true if you're just in on these colors. And even if you don't pay the kicker here, you have a great card in a 4 mana 3/4 flying and lifelink, that's like a B, and if you do pay the kicker, you get to cast Shock twice. You can do it on 2 separate targets or to 1 if you want, and because of lifelink, it's going to feel like Lightning Helix stapled to a flyer. Obviously, you need to be at least splashing 1 or both of these colors to get full value. But like I said, that's very doable. This is a bomb, I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Argivian Cavalier, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 Orc Knight at common. It has Enlist. First time we're seeing this mechanic, so I'll read the reminder text. As this creature attacks, you may tap a non-attacking creature you control without summoning sickness. When you do, add its power to this creature's until end of turn, and when it enters the battlefield, you get a 1/1 white soldier creature token. This is a nice common. We see 3 mana 2/2s that spit out 1/1s a lot, and they're always solid at the very worst. And this one comes with Enlist upside, and it can even use its token to attack as a 3/2. This is probably one of white's best commons. It also benefits from the fact that going wide is a huge theme in white. I think overall, this is a B-. Next up, it's Argivian Phalanx, which for 5 generic and a white is a 4/4 human core soldier at common. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature you control, and it has vigilance. So if you can consistently cast this for 4, I think you'll be happy with the card, and that does seem like a pretty reasonable outcome. White has plenty of ways to go wide too. We've already seen one of them, and we're going to see more, so I think you can pretty consistently cast this for a reasonable cost, and sometimes even be able to play it above curve. It will feel kind of disastrous to have this if your opponent has managed to interfere with your development, or if you haven't drawn well though. Next up, it's Artillery Blast, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant. It comes with Domain, which means you get some sort of effect based on the number of basic land types among lands you control. In this case, the blast deals X damage to target tapped creature, where X is 1, plus the number of basic land types among lands you control. This falls very short from being premium removal. Sure, Domain is something you can get going in this format without a ton of trouble, but the fact that this already limits itself to only being able to damage tapped creatures, and it requires some significant help to do more than 2 damage, means that I will only run this card in a deck that is really good at getting Domain, and even only then if I don't have other removal that isn't so dependent on Domain. There are a lot of better options out there. I think this is a C-, and it's probably, or potentially at least, even worse than that. Next up, it's Banalish Faith Bonder, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/3 human cleric at common. It's got Vigilance and Enlist. A 2-mana 1/3 with Vigilance is probably like a C-. Adding Enlist is pretty nice on a Vigilance creature too, because Enlist naturally has you tapping things down for your attacks, but at least your Enlist creature, in this case, doesn't get tapped. This seems solid. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Banalish Sleeper, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 Ferexian human soldier at common. It's got Kicker for 1 black, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, each player sacrifices a creature. This is a nice 2-drop. 2-mana 3/1s are pretty solid and limited, so the Edict effect upside is very real. There are plenty of times when kicking this is better for you than your opponent, and when that's true, it'll feel great. Now, there's also going to be times where kicking it doesn't really do much or hurts you more than your opponent, so temper your expectations. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Captain's Call, which for 3 generic and a white is a common sorcery that creates 3 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. So this is not the most efficient token generator we've ever seen, especially at sorcery speed, but white does have a pretty big go-wide theme going on, and as a result, I think you play the first copy of this in a lot of your white decks. It still isn't amazing, but there is a reason to get 3 bodies out of 1 card in white. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Charismatic Vanguard, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 dwarf soldier at common, and for 4 generic and a white, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This has mediocre stats that make it pretty unimpressive on turn 3, but it also has an ability that can do some work in the late game. Even if it is a bit expensive, it's an okay mana sink in a color that likes to go wide. There are many better ways to pump your whole board though, and that definitely hurts this card's stock. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Citizen's Arrest, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a common enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls until Citizen's Arrest leaves the battlefield. This seems like it reaches into the lower range of premium removal. These sorts of cards seem to be getting worse these days since so many creatures have entered the battlefield abilities. Still, it can deal with any creature or planeswalker, and that's nice. The double white is a bit of a downer since you can't splash it very easily, but this does really efficiently deal with a whole range of creatures. Pretty much any creature can at least be exiled by this, and that's pretty good. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Cleaving Skyrider, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 human warrior at uncommon. It's got Flash. It has Kicker for 2 generic and a red. It has Flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the number of attacking creatures. This is a really good uncommon. I'm already going to play a 3-mana 2/2 flyer with Flash, that's probably a C, so adding the big upside of Kicker here is really nice. You can flash it in when you're the one attacking to kill a blocker or something, or maybe even it helps you do lethal to your opponent, but it's pretty sweet that you can also use it when your opponent is attacking you, in which case it will usually account for 2 bodies between killing one and blocking one. Paying 6 for this is going to do a ton of work in many situations. Now, there will be times where you just have to run this out as a Windrake with Flash, but that is a decent fail case. And the upside is massive. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Clockwork Drawbridge, which for 1 white mana is a 0/3 artifact creature wall at common. It has Defender, and for 2 generic and a white, you can tap it and tap target creature. This isn't very good, even in the Defender deck in the format, which does look like a real thing. It has mediocre stats, and it costs a little too much to tap stuff down. The effect itself is nice, but 3 mana is a ton for it. I think you'll end up playing this if you really need more defenders to get your critical mass in that type of deck, but even in that deck, you're probably hoping you don't have to play this defender. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Coalition Sky Knight, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/2 human knight at uncommon. It's got Flying and Enlist. As soon as they showed us Enlist was a thing, I knew slapping it on a flyer would be pretty sweet, and that is what we have here. This will be able to attack pretty hard in the air if it has a friend around. The downside is that it has some very mediocre base stats, and it's the kind of 4-drop that dies to common 1 and 2 mana removal, and that tempo hit can be brutal. With 2 toughness, it also doesn't take much reach or flying to just block it and kill it either. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Danitha, Benalia's Hope, which for 4 generic and a white is a 4/4 legendary human knight at rare. It has first strike, vigilance, and lifelink, and when it enters the battlefield, you may put an aura or equipment card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield attached to Danitha. So, even if she didn't do the aura stuff, a 5 mana 4/4 with all these keywords is a B at worst. So the question is, how much value can you get out of her enter the battlefield ability? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that you really want to be getting the card from the graveyard in an ideal world, because if you're getting a card from the graveyard, you're actually getting a full card worth of value. If you're putting a card in from your hand, you're just getting a discount on a card you already have. You're not getting an additional card. You still have the same number of cards as you had when you cast Danitha. Obviously, putting something discounted on Danitha is also really good, especially because it attaches for free in the case of equipment. So there are auras and equipments in this format, but getting them into your graveyard, which is the ideal thing, isn't that easy, first of all. And second of all, there aren't so many good auras and equipment that Danitha will really just take off. I think with just like 1 or 2 more good equipments or auras, especially in white, Danitha would probably reach into the bomb range, but because I think a lot of the time she's just, just a 5 mana first strike, vigilance, lifelink, 4/4, which is still a really good card, but I don't think quite a bomb. I'm giving her a B+. I could see her being better if it turns out it's even easier than I'm thinking to really get the amazing value out of her. But, the fail case with this card is a very, very, very good card. So, you're just going to play it all the time, regardless of auras or equipments. Next up, it's Defiler of Faith, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 5/5 Phyrexian human at rare. It's got vigilance, and it has an additional cost to cast white permanent spells. You can pay 2 life. Those spells cost 1 white mana less to cast if you paid life this way. This effect reduces only the amount of white mana you pay. Whenever you cast a white permanent spell, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So there's a whole cycle of rare Defilers in this set, and they are all really, really good. They all let you do a pseudo-Phyrexian mana thing, which is what the first ability is. You can pay life instead of one of the white mana symbols in one of your permanents. And then they all give you some trigger when you cast a white permanent spell. Well, a permanent spell of their color, in this case, white. So the base here is a 5 mana 5/5 with vigilance. That's like a B- at the very worst. And then the 2 abilities on top of that are very good. Making your spells cheaper and generating tokens is a good way to win games. With all of these, if you could somehow end up in like a straight up monocolored deck, they'll be completely insane. But even in a normal 2-color deck, they're going to be very, very good. They're going to be reducing the cost of multiple permanents and generating 1/1 tokens for you in this case. And I think that makes this a bomb, I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Destroy Evil, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant. It says choose one, destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater, or destroy target enchantment. So if either of these modes were alone, this wouldn't not be a great card, but putting them both together does mean most opponents will have enough combined targets for this to do a decent job. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Griffin Protector, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/3 Griffin at common with flying, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a reprint, and it overperformed when we last saw it. I think it'll be pretty nice here too, as the go wide theme in white is fairly pronounced, as we've already seen in this video. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Guardian of New Benalia, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human soldier at rare. It has Enlist, and when Guardian of New Benalia enlists a creature, you scry 2, and you can discard a card to have it gain indestructible until end of turn and tap it. This looks really good. A 2 mana 2/2 with Enlist is already something you'd always play, because it's a creature that can really hit hard, meaning it can attack on a wider variety of board states, and that's basically what's good about Enlist in general. Your Enlist creatures can get stats that are high enough that the best your opponent can do is trade with them. So adding the scry and indestructible upside makes this a really good card, because it can grow its power and be a relevant attacker every single turn, and when you can back it up with an effect that allows it to become indestructible, that's a big deal. Note, by the way, the tap effect here is not part of the cost, it's part of the effect, so it can become indestructible even when attacking, and that's kind of the whole point. This is a B+. Next up, it's Heroic Charge, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a common instant. It has Kicker for 1 generic and a red. Creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. If this spell was kicked, those creatures also gain Trample until end of turn. So they added some pretty real kicker upside to Inspired Charge, and Inspired Charge in the past has been a card that you end up playing one of in lots of decks that go wide. I love the ability to add Trample here in the late game, as it will make it even easier for you to get lethal to go through. I do sort of feel like this needs a build-around grade because you really need to be very, very adept at going wide, or it just isn't worth it. If your deck is just okay at getting a bunch of creatures in play, you really shouldn't play this. It's a very all-or-nothing type card. It's probably a D+ in your typical red-white deck, and the first copy is a C+ in decks that are really good at going wide. Next up, it's Join Forces, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon instant. It says untap up to 2 target creatures. They each get +2/+2 until end of turn. I'm not usually a huge fan of tricks once they get beyond 1 mana, or especially beyond 2 mana, but this one costs 3 and I'm a little bit interested in it because it has 2-for-1 potential. It also adds Pseudo Vigilance if you use it on the attack because of the untap effect, which of course also means you can ambush block the opponent. But it is almost always better to use tricks offensively, since your opponent is less likely to have mana on your turn. But untapping your creatures and helping them win combat is pretty sweet. It does still cost 3, which is a very real amount of mana for a temporary boost, but because sometimes you'll be able to buff 2 creatures and kill 2 of your opponent's creatures while keeping yours alive, I think the upside is enough and the downside is reasonable enough that this is a C. Next up, it's Juniper Order Root Weaver, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human druid at common. It has Kicker for a green, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. This is a nice white common. It can just be a bear, or it can be a 3-mana 2/2 that puts a counter somewhere. The counter effect is the sort of thing that tends to be useful all game long, since in the later stages you can find somewhere to put that token, or that counter, that makes a difference. In the early game, you may just want to make this a 3-mana 3/3, which is a fine fail case. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Knight of Dawn's Light, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human knight at uncommon. It has First Strike. If you would gain life, you gain that much life +1 instead, and for 1 generic and a white, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is really good. 2-mana 2/2s with First Strike are already like a B-. That's just a stat line that's great all game long, and this has 2 additional abilities. Augmenting your life gain isn't a huge deal, especially because this format doesn't have like a dedicated life gain deck, but there is life gain going on and making it better is nice. But being able to pump itself is also really good. This means it's great as a 2-drop, and in the late game you can attack with it with a bunch of mana untapped, and your opponent really can't block it very effectively. This is maybe white's best uncommon. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Leyline Binding, which for 5 generic and a white is a rare enchantment with flash. It has Domain. It costs 1 less to cast for each basic land type among lands you control, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. This looks like premium removal. You'll cast it for 5 at the very most, and while that's not ideal, a 5-mana Oblivion Ring with Flash is a pretty good fail case. You'll often be able to cast it for 4, and casting it for 3 is of course quite doable. Adding Flash isn't a small thing either, as it really opens up blowout potential that most versions of this type of effect aren't capable of. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Love Song of Night and Day. It's 2 generic and a white for an uncommon enchantment saga. That's right, sagas are back. And you have an additional mechanic here called Read Ahead. It says choose a chapter and start with that many lore counters. Add 1 after your draw step. Skip chapters, don't trigger. Sacrifice after chapter 3. So in other words, you get to decide where the saga begins. You ignore any chapters before the chapter you choose to be the starting chapter. And that adds some neat modality to the sagas in this set. So Chapter 1 says, you and target opponent each draw 2 cards. Chapter 2, create a 1/1 white bird creature token with flying. And Chapter 3 says, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. So I think you'll frequently want to skip Chapter 1 here, since it does benefit your opponent as well as you. And really, they kind of come out ahead, since you just spent mana on a card and they just got to draw 2 cards for 0 mana. Sometimes you will do Chapter 1 like if you're desperate for a specific card or really need some gas, but the good news is just getting Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 is plenty of value for the investment, and so you really have Chapter 1 as this lesser used mode on the card, but it's nice upside to have on a card that already gives you a 1/1 flyer and 2 +1/+1 counters. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Mesa Cavalier, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/1 human knight at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life. This is like a textbook C-. It has mediocre stats, and it does do a small thing when it enters the battlefield. It's a card that you don't hope to play, but it's fine when you do, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Phyrexian Missionary, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/3 Phyrexian human cleric at uncommon. It's got kicker for 1 generic and a black. It has lifelink, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is really good. A 2-mana 2/3 with lifelink is a C+ at the very worst, and the kicker upside here is massive, as it sets up a 2-for-1 while getting you back something useful from the graveyard. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Prayer of Binding, which for 3 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 1 target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Prayer of Binding leaves the battlefield, and you gain 2 life. It's kind of weird how many Oblivion Ring sets there are in this format. There's one at rare, there's one at common, and there's one at uncommon, and this is another good one. It might cost 1 more than Citizen's Arrest, but it can remove all non-land permanent types. It's easier to splash with only 1 white mana required, and having flash also enables the card to generate some blowouts that aren't possible with sorcery speed versions of the effect, and the life gain doesn't hurt either. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Resolute Reinforcements, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 human soldier at uncommon. It's got flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So this is basically a creature-based version of Raise the Alarm, and Raise the Alarm is always solid. Making it a creature is better in most ways because it means you can abuse its enter the battlefield ability, and your opponent can't just bounce it and make it disappear. 2 mana for 2/2 of stats at instant speed is a nice deal, especially with all the go-wide stuff going on here. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Runic Shot, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon sorcery. It has kicker for 1 blue. Destroy target tapped creature. If this spell was kicked, scry 2. This is a very low cost for this effect. I normally don't love this type of removal spell since it isn't especially good when you're the aggressor because it doesn't get blockers out of the way, but we usually see this sort of spell cost 2 or 3 mana, so dropping it to 1 is a big deal, and the scry upside matters too. You do generally have to get attacked by something once before you can use this, which is kind of a bummer, but I actually think the efficiency here is enough for me to start this in the lower range of premium removal. The tempo you can get from this is going to be very real, giving this a B-. Next up, it's Samite Herbalist, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/1 human cleric at common. When it becomes tapped, you gain 1 life and scry 1. So the idea here is to use this for enlist effects, and it's certainly nice to get extra value when you're tapping your creature. Obviously, it can also just give you this trigger when it attacks, and anytime you can at least trade with something, that will feel fine. Also works crewing vehicles. There aren't a lot of them in the format though. This seems like a C. Next up, it's Sarah Paragon, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a 3/4 angel at mythic rare with flying. Once during each of your turns, you may play a land from your graveyard or cast a permanent spell with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard. If you do it, it gains, when this permanent is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, exile it, and you gain 2 life. So this is really good. It's sort of like a larger version of Luris that doesn't have companion. A 4 mana 3/4 flyer is pretty close to a B. And the upside here is massive. Playing something from your graveyard every turn is pretty sweet and a good way to win the game. The downside, I suppose, is that you won't always have something, especially on turn 4, but you can kind of plan for that by trading more aggressively and stuff like that ahead of playing the Paragon. The life gain tacked onto things is great too. If you only get 1 card back before the Paragon dies, you're getting a 2-for-1, and that seems very easy to accomplish. In addition to the fact that if it sticks around much longer, it's just going to win you the game. I'm giving this an A. Next up, it's Shalais Acolyte, which for 4 generic and a white is a 3/4 angel at uncommon. It has kicker for 1 generic and a green. It has flying, and if it's kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters. This is the kind of kicker creature that is sneaky good in limited. If you've played in limited formats before that have kicker that make creatures better in the later game, you probably know this, but if you haven't, you're probably looking at this and underrating it. Neither mode of the card is that impressive, a 5 mana 3/4 flyer or a 7 mana 5/6 flyer, but the modality is a big deal, and neither mode is terrible. If you need to play it early, you won't be ashamed to, and when you cast it late, sure, it's a little inefficient, but it's most likely the largest flyer on the board. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Stall for Time, which for 2 generic and a white is a common instant with Kicker for 1 generic and a blue. You tap up to 2 target creatures, and if the spell was kicked, you put a stun counter on each of those creatures. This is a new mechanic, and if a permanent with a stun counter would become untapped, remove a counter from it instead, draw a card. This is sort of passable when you don't kick it, since it replaces itself and it's an instant, so you can shut down an entire round of attacking and blocking by those 2 creatures. Kicking it is the real dream though, since those stun counters will really give you some amazing tempo. This is a C+. Next up, it's Take Up the Shield, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant. It says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. This sort of trick is always okay. It has the flexibility of protecting the creature from removal, and it's useful in combat, but the usual downside most tricks have, that they're situational and they open you up to a 2-for-1 when you're not careful, are pretty big problems. Still, the first copy seems fine in aggro decks. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Temporary Lockdown, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you exile each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less until Temporary Lockdown leaves the battlefield. This card mostly isn't meant for limited. It hates on a pretty narrow thing, which is awkwardly also a thing you'll probably have some of on your side of the table. It's hard to manufacture situations where this helps you more than it helps your opponent. It is definitely a powerful sideboard option in best of 3 because sometimes you do go up against some deck that gets completely wrecked by this, but it isn't often enough for you to put it in your main deck. I think it's probably a D if you decide to play it in your main deck, and a C out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Urza Assembles the Titans, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a rare enchantment saga. It has read ahead. Chapter 1 says scry 4, then you may reveal the top card of your library. If a planeswalker card is revealed this way, put it into your hand. Chapter 2 says you may put a planeswalker card with mana value 6 or less from your hand onto the battlefield. And Chapter 3 says you may activate the loyalty abilities of planeswalkers you control twice this turn rather than only once. This is unplayable in limited. Planeswalkers are only at Mythic Rare in this set, so all of these effects are almost entirely meaningless. You basically pay 5 mana to scry 4. Even if you have like 2 Planeswalkers by some crazy stroke of luck, this is still pretty bad. I'm giving this an F. Next up, it's Valiant Veteran, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 core soldier at rare. Other soldiers you control get +1/+1, and for 3 generic and 2 white, you can exile it from your graveyard and put a +1/+1 counter on each soldier you control. So there's a whole cycle of lords in this set, and I think this is the best of all of them in limited. The other ones support creature types that there just aren't enough of in the set for them to be great, but that's not true here. It benefits from the fact that most of the tokens we saw in this video themselves are soldiers, and there's also just a lot of commons and uncommons with the soldier creature type. So if you're just playing a regular white deck with commons and uncommons in it, Valiant Veteran is going to make like 5 or 6 of your cards better without you even trying, and obviously you're going to value soldiers a little more if you do have a Valiant Veteran, especially because, you know, he gives you value when he's on the table, and then he can also give you even more value out of the graveyard. So I don't quite think he's a bomb because he does take some work, but he's going to work out pretty well in pretty much all your white decks. I'm giving him a B+. Next up, it's Winged Mantle Champion, which is also our last white card. For 3 generic and a white, it is a 0/3 human cleric at uncommon with Defender. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 white bird creature token with flying for each creature with Defender you control. And whenever another creature with Defender enters the battlefield under your control, you create a 1/1 white bird creature token with flying. So this is a super powerful build around for the Defender decks. On its own, it's a 4 mana 0/3 that makes a 1/1 flyer, which is pretty bad. But that's the baseline for this card, and it will often do much more than that. What I really like about it is no matter when you draw it, whether you draw it in the late game when your board already has like 3 defenders on it, or if it's your first defender on the table, it's going to generate value for you, both from what you've already played and both from what you will play. And that's what makes it really strong to me. Obviously, creating an army of flyers is pretty good. Even if you're just getting a second flyer out of this, you are very happy with your mana investment. All of that said, this is still a build around. I think all the Defender things are, because some of them, defenders that you're going to have to shove into your deck to make these good, are just so bad otherwise. This isn't exactly one of them, but I think it's probably a D in your typical white deck, but like a B build around, and a card that's really going to be your win condition in a lot of these Defender decks. So, those are my thoughts on all the white cards in Dominaria United. Tomorrow, I'll be back to talk about all the blue ones, and we'll keep going with a video every day until we're done. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review and a whole lot of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.